Hello, wonderful humans, and welcome to my living room. My name is Yoanna, and I'm very excited that you made some time to join me today. This talk is really near and dear to my heart because it touches on my two big passions in life: travel and understanding how people do work. During the day, I'm a user experience researcher at Google, and when I'm not at work understanding how cloud developers do work, I am traveling, thinking about traveling, I'm planning my next trip. My goal for today is that after these 30 minutes, you're going to walk away with a clear sense of what design ethnography can do for you in your practice as a UX practitioner. And at the end of this, you're going to be convinced that the true superpower that this methodology has in our industry context, it's its ability to connect the decision makers with the user base. So this is how the talk is going to work today. First, I'm going to tell you a story because in my experience, every single great talk that I've been a part of has always been grounded around a story. Then we're briefly going to cover what design ethnography is and when it's appropriate for you to use. And finally, I'm going to give you the 3 heuristics that I have found in my own career that are extremely helpful to guarantee that your design ethnography project is going to be impactful in your organization. And then for each of these 3 heuristics, first I am going to cover like the how-to, the theory of how you go about it, and then I'm going to give you a few examples using a case study from a past project from my career on how I was able to apply that theory into practice for that organization. Around 1998 or so, Procter & Gamble, they tried to enter the Chinese market and introduce Pampers into the Chinese culture with a cheaper version of a product that was pretty much inferior in quality to their version for the Western product. They assumed that all Chinese consumers were bargainers when it came to all of their purchases. And after struggling for a little while and failing to sell as many Pampers as they wanted, they really wanted to understand why Pampers was not selling as much as they had initially intended in China. So they sent a group of people from Procter & Gamble to China. Among these group of people, there were a group of researchers, and the researchers in their group, they decided as part of their Chinese visit to go into Chinese parents' homes to try to understand and observe their diapering practices and conduct some interviews along the way. After many site visits and interviews, the researchers realized that the failure to gain traction in the Chinese market from the Pampers product was due to 2 main reasons. One of them was a cultural bias, and the second reason was a cultural variable. So in the Chinese market, the cultural variable was essentially that they were commonly using something that is called kaidanku. Part of my pronunciation, I really don't know Mandarin, but they have been raising children using these open crush pants for centuries that you can see on the picture. In the other hand, there was an emerging middle class in the 90s that was very concerned about the One China policy that the government had introduced to the country a few years prior. And this was the subcultural variable that the Procter & Gamble company failed to consider when they were introducing Pampers into the market. Another thing that went wrong with Procter & Gamble as they were introducing the Pampers is that they assumed that all of the Chinese parents would be primarily concerned with cost. However, this emerging middle class of mothers tended to make their purchasing decisions based on what was best for that one child that they had, rather than what was cheaper for that kid. And at the end of the day, to the Chinese moms and dads, Pampers was just considered to be an irritating piece of plastic that they didn't want to put their children's in. However, These researchers not only identified why the product had failed, they had also identified a potential value proposition that could help reintroduce this product in China. And because of this same one China policy, parents really wanted this one child that they had to succeed. And they were really motivated to improve early childhood cognitive development for their children. That finding of wanting to improve their early childhood cognitive development was used as the cornerstone for what it is today considered one of the most successful marketing campaigns in the history of Procter & Gamble. And this campaign was called the Golden Sleep Campaign. They were promoting that a baby wearing Pampers will sleep longer through the night, and more sleep had been found to be tied to improve cognitive development. So this scientific campaign boasted scientific results such as baby wearing Pampers sleeps with 50% less disruption, and baby wearing Pampers falls asleep 30% faster. The success of this campaign was huge, and it really propelled Pampers in China, and by 2010 they were the #1 selling brand of diapers in the country, and disposable diapers had pretty much become commonplace. So the work those researchers did in China via their site visits, it's a clear example of design ethnography, and the Pampers story is a great example of how design ethnography can really help change the future of a company quite significantly. So now that we've covered a bit of the Pampers story, I want to spend some time covering what design ethnography is and when it's appropriate to use. And as with many of the UXR methods that we leverage and love today, design ethnography has its roots in the social sciences, and it comes from the principles of ethnographic research that has been applied by anthropologists for years and years. Ethnography literally means a portrait of people, and anthropologists will spend months and years engaging and living among those who they are studying. Their goal is to describe the group or the culture by focusing on them holistically, looking at people, looking at their behaviors, their interactions, and their environments. So now, in the industry, we perform much shorter ethnographic engagements than what an anthropologist will do via ethnographic research. And we engage with our subjects more around the line of days or weeks instead of months and years. But at its core, we still ground design ethnography, which is what we do in the industry, on those two principles of ethnography, being holistic and being descriptive. If you're listening to me, I probably don't need to convince you that design ethnography is a very powerful research method, but it does take a lot of planning and buy-in to execute properly. So my first piece of advice is that you have to be very selective with the type of design problem that this method is actually a good candidate and a good fit for. The problem is that we run the risk, if we don't execute right the first time, that our team and our company may become a little bit predisposed to the method. So the first step to ensure that your design ethnography project is going to have impact and is going to be successful is to make sure that your design problem that you're tackling will be a good candidate for you to run a design ethnography project. In my experience, there are 6 main types of design problems that are good candidates, and we will cover those next so that you know to identify them when you see them. So the first problem is that oftentimes your team will be working on a product around a work area that they know very little about, and gaining some understanding of those settings, it's really needed so that the technologies can suit the situations of their use. The second design problem where design ethnography is really well suited for is to eliminate the designer's worldview. So if designers have little information regarding the situations in which technologies are going to be used, the best way, sometimes the best they can do is just to rely on their own experiences and imagination, and by doing that they're running the risk of designing technologies that are probably better suited to their needs than those of the actual users. The third type of problem where design ethnography is immensely helpful is when there are situations where designers and engineering teams and anybody who works on product development, they create technologies whose possible use cases are unknown. And such situations might be described as technology in search of an application. So some understanding of the work in which potential users are engaged can really help identify some possible uses and refine the technology design. Next, another case where this is really helpful and valuable is when, as we all know, utilization of technology is like intrinsically linked to the conditions of the user's environment, right? And sometimes with other research methods like interviews and surveys, we fail to capture some nuances around the context that are so important to the design, right? So with design ethnography, you're really paying attention to the context. So this method is particularly well suited as a methodology when you need to better understand the context of its use. Then going back to working in a space where you may be introducing some new technologies, it's always important to keep in mind that users are often unable to give meaningful responses to your questions, especially when you're asking them how they may use something that they've never used before, that is like brand new, you are trying to introduce. So in order to create the context for such a discussion and to be useful partners in the joint exploration of the relationship between work and technology, we must understand the user's work, and design ethnography can really help you get there. And finally, there are many workflows and work practices that are not single task or done by only one user, and simply focusing on a single task or the task of a single user tends to ignore how the work of one individual articulates with what many others do, right? So design ethnography really helps you see the influences other people have on that primary user that you're trying to study. So that's another example of a design problem where design ethnography is particularly well suited for. So far we have covered a bit about what design ethnography is and what are some of the type of design problems that are good candidates for this type of methodology. Now I want to give you the 3 best practices or heuristics that I have found in my own career to be very useful to ensure that your design ethnography project is going to be a total success and very impactful. So for each of these 3 best practices, I'm first going to tell you a bit about how to go about it, what are some of the things in theory that you need to consider, and then I'm gonna show you how I applied that best practice and theory via an example from my past work experience. And the example that we are going to be using today for the rest of this presentation is from a few years back. I used to work for a somewhat large North American airline, and it turned out that the business really wanted to move to a fully remote mobile workforce, so that they decided that it was going to be a good idea to give all of their customer service agents, pilots, flight attendants mobile devices. However, after a year or so, they realized that the workforce was actually not using the devices, but specifically the customer service agents. So as you can see on the picture here, they were just carrying their iPads turned off, and oftentimes they were just like leaving them at the podiums and not bringing them with them throughout their day. So design ethnography was a key tool in my researcher arsenal to help the company understand why was this lack of adoption of the iPads happening, and more importantly, being able to find a value proposition so that the customer service agent actually saw some value on wanting to use these iPads. My first heuristic that I want you to keep in mind when thinking of undertaking a project which is going to involve some design ethnography is that I want you to go back to that first principle of ethnography that we discussed before today. And remember that that design ethnography is supposed to be holistic, but not absolute. You're not going to be able to observe every single workflow and every single interaction for every single different type of user. Your time in the field is going to be very limited. A good way to ensure that you gather a holistic view of the problems is by focusing on a key area that you really want to study. And in order to do that, you really have to practice very diligent scoping, try to focus your research area for fieldwork as much as you can. Oftentimes, this means that you must engage in some other research efforts first. Think of small research activities that can help you reduce the scope of your fieldwork research. Things like a survey, some stakeholder interviews, some subject matter expert interviews. These smaller research projects can be good pointers when you are lacking where to focus on for your fieldwork activities. And they may help you identify areas of knowledge where the team is lacking a level of richness that you can then bring from the field. Another way in which you can start finding some focus for your project is by looking at data that you already have. Many times logs data is available, operational data is available, and this can really help you see areas and workflows where there are already some pain points and problems, friction areas that you want to hone in and pay close attention when you are on the field. So what this meant for me in the airline project that we're gonna be sharing with you today. So one of the first things that we actually did to try to understand what our customer service agents view as problem area is that we actually ran a small survey with the customer service agents. And not only were we trying to figure out why they were not using the iPads, but we also wanted to try to identify some areas where they had expressed they were already struggling and the company was not offering to them all of the tools and documents that they needed in order to be able to be effective at doing their work. At the same time, we also ran a small workshop with the leadership team to try to understand what their true goals for this iPad introduction were. And we created, this workshop actually served two purposes. One, we were able to get them all in the same role to try to understand their end goal, but we also wanted to generate a level of excitement about this project and about us going into the field. So this small workshop really served those two purposes for us. Finally, the last thing that we actually did even before we went out into the field to do the observations is that we decided to look at operational data that we had available. And in this operational data, we were able to identify the top reasons the company took delays when the customer service agent was involved or was the main reason for that airplane being delayed. Putting all of these things together, it really helped us narrow our focus for our fieldwork observations, and instead of just concentrating on the entire day of a customer service agent at the airport, we were able to narrow it down to observing the gate experience of the boarding agent when they're helping depart the flight, right? So we really wanted to focus on that boarding experience that was tied to a flight departure. And what we did is, in a period of about 2 weeks or so, we went to different airports all over the United States, and we watched and followed customer service agents as they were boarding planes, and we started watching right before their boarding duties began, and we continued to observe them throughout the boarding period until the plane had actually departed. And then we will get introduced to a new customer service agent, and then we will start the process all over again, following them throughout the airport during the boarding period until the flight was departed. And I think we did about 60 to 65 hours of customer service observations, boarding thousands of passengers into flights. The second best practice or guidance that I have for you all to ensure that your design ethnography exercise and your field observations are going to be holistic and not absolutes is to try to concentrate on the exchanges between the agents. So one of the beauties of applying design ethnography is that it really allows you to pay attention to the impact the other people have on your main user. So making sure that you are capturing a holistic view is very important. And what this means is that you may have to do some planning in your observation plan to make sure that you're considering the impact other roles and other agents have in your main user to make sure that they're able to accomplish their goal. So what this meant in the Alaska example is that since we knew the company was all about improving the operational excellence, we made sure to create templates, observation templates, that were timeline and role oriented so that we could capture tasks and pain points tied by time periods, and also by capturing all of the interaction points between the customer service agent, the customer service agent and the pilot, the flight attendant and the customer service agent, and also the relationship between the customer service agent who was boarding the flight and the customer service agent who was controlling the flight. My second big heuristic, and this is probably the one that I think it's most important to really make sure you follow, and is that rich data deserves rich artifacts and rich deliverables, right? By now you may be asking yourself, but Yoanna, as researchers, when I do my research, of course, I need to be able to produce a rich deliverable, and I need to be able to produce a great report for my stakeholders. But this is true to the next level when it comes to design ethnography, because in a field observation and with design ethnography, you're gonna have access to so much more, so much rich data. You're gonna have access to the user's environment, you're gonna have access to the context, you're gonna have first-hand view of tacit knowledge that could not otherwise be captured during interviews. And furthermore, this type of foundational findings and all of this data that is so rich that you're gonna bring from the field tends to have a very long shelf life. So it's definitely worth that you spend some time, a significant amount of time, making sure that your deliverables are like really polished and really well put together. So in order to make sure that you're producing really rich artifacts, I really want you to spend some time thinking of ways in which you can communicate the workflows and the experience. Pictures are good, but what else? What else can you do to transport others there, right? As a good rule of thumb, in my experience, you should spend at least as much time producing these artifacts and creating these artifacts as you were out on the field. If you spend 60 hours on the field, spend 60 hours producing really good, high quality, rich artifacts, because they're gonna have a very long shelf life. If you can spend 2 to 3 times as much time as you spend in the field crafting these artifacts, the better that's gonna be. This is really not the station when you wanna save time and just like cut corners. Trust me. And to give you an example of like the type of artifacts that I was able to produce and the team was able to produce, this is one right here. This is an example of the boarding agent timeline, and this really covered all the tasks and interaction the boarding agent needed to do and needed to accomplish in order to have that flight depart. And we got really excited with this timeline. And again, this shows scopes. We didn't do it about like the entire day of the customer service agent. We just scoped it down to the boarding process. But what was very exciting is that when we took a look at the task and then we compare that to like their official manual of how they were supposed to be accomplishing those tasks, we realized that tasks that initially were set to happen at the end of the boarding process, the customer service agent actually had brought them closer to the middle and to the front of their timeline because it was physically impossible to be able to accomplish those tasks in the time that it was listed in their company manual. So when we saw that, we really got really giddy and excited because that was a truly exciting finding that we could build upon. And not only are you gonna be producing rich deliverables from your findings, but the key with design ethnography is that you really wanna have a strong researcher point of view of what your recommendations are going to be, because it's not enough just to have 60 hours of wonderful field work and a bunch of findings. You really want to have a concise, strong recommendation that you can bring to your stakeholders. So in the Alaska project, we identified a piece of the workflow from the timeline that you saw before, where we thought we could introduce the iPad and more specifically a simple app so that we could add some value into the boarding agent process and not only offer some value to them, but also at the same time saving the company some money by shaving some minutes out of the departure timeline. And you're gonna see on this little graph over here that we're trying to illustrate what the order and the time that things took in the initial process, and then our proposal for how we were going to change that process with the introduction of an iPad. So you see there is a time where the boarding agent has to physically go check that everyone that is not on the plane is actually not on the plane, so that nobody was able to get through security without being scanned. So in order to do that, they print something that is called a not on list. So this list, it used to be printed in one of those like very old carbon copy printers that made lots and lots and lots. Please insert some noise. Then the agent will physically take this piece of paper, walk it down to the aircraft, check that the folks were not on, then walk all the way back to the jetway, to the podium, just to tell the other person working the flight the person is actually not on the flight. And then that person will be able to like close the flight, and then they will have to print another very long piece of paperwork called the final paperwork. Insert noise again by the annoying printer machine. And then they will take it back down to the gateway again and give it to the flight attendant so that they could finally close the door to the aircraft. And this entire process, as we documented it, on average from all of the flights that we observed, it took about 8 minutes to complete. And the agents really had to walk back and forth and moving like really fast, running pretty much down this jetway. So instead, when we presented this artifact to our stakeholders, we said, hey, if we're able to introduce a mobile app that the agent can just like grab, take down to the aircraft, and from the aircraft itself, they can communicate with both the control agent and send the final paperwork, we can save a ton of time with the printing, we can save a ton of time with the walking back and forth, and just make it a better process and pretty much cut this process in almost half. So basically saving a few minutes out of the departure timeline means millions for an airline. So the small iPad application that we were proposing would pay itself within a few weeks of use. So when we took this recommendation in that way to our stakeholders, this really made it really clear to them to see what the impact of this change will actually have in the departure timeline. And finally, the last thing, or the last big heuristic to consider, is that for things to actually get done and ensure that your project is going to be really impactful, you really have to connect your decision maker to the user. And design ethnography will give you all of the ammunition that you require. The first step in order to ensure that you're connecting the decision maker to the user is that you truly have to understand the decision maker. How will they measure? What are some of the things that they care about? So that you know how to present the things to them in a way that is impactful for them. And that is why, going back to the scoping piece, that is why it was so important for us to have this discussion with them early on, so that we could align on a mission and on a vision, and get them excited about the type of work that we were gonna out and do in the field, right? And the second piece here to make sure that you are connecting that decision maker to the user is that you're going to produce all of these amazing rich deliverables, but your job is not only to produce those deliverables, but also help your stakeholder to consume those deliverables. And one of the things that we did in Alaska, just to make this even clearer for our stakeholders, is that we felt like we needed to sell what the experience was going to be once we introduced the iPad. So we quickly worked on a prototype so that we could, one, we had already filmed the existing process at the airport, and then we created a little video with a counter just to show the stakeholders how long the current process took for our customer service agents to accomplish. And then we took our little iPad prototype and mocked the experience out of the airport to show them, as you can see on those images over here, how we were going to be able to reduce so many minutes out of the departure timeline for our customer service agents, and eventually the company as a whole, by removing all of this printing and all of this unnecessary walking. So, in conclusion, for your design ethnography project to be impactful, if you walk away with anything out of this presentation, first of all, please do make sure that you have a design problem that is actually a good candidate for running design ethnography as a methodology. And if you find a design problem that is a good candidate, please do apply these 3 best practices. Make sure that your focus on your fieldwork observations are holistic and not absolute. Ensure that the rich data deserves really rich deliverables. Please spend at least the same amount of time you spent out on the field working on your deliverables, preferably 2 to 3 times the amount of hours you spend doing your field observations. And do connect your decision maker with the user, not only by showing them these artifacts that you've been able to produce, but also by helping them consume these artifacts and provide a solid recommendation of what the changes need to be. It's not good enough just to show your findings and just show the things that you have learned out on the field. You have to present a strong, solid point of view as a researcher that you have for the company as your recommendation. Thank you very much. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk, and please do reach out if you have any questions. Thank you. Bye.